Hi everyone. So this is my clickbait. This is my clickbait title. And FE Dev spent 8 hours on his long weekend working on this. Here's what happened to me. So in case y'all don't know me yet, oops. In case y'all don't know me yet, I'm Tan Yang. I'm a front-end engineer at Shopee. I do mostly the promotional stuff. I do weird shit with CSS and JavaScript, sometimes literally, like this one over here. But most of you already know me by now. That's not important. More importantly is more related to this topic, right? There's so many things that I want to do. I like to do front end, I like to do back end, I like to do AI, hardware stuff. And sometimes and right now I'm actually in the process of moving my house. So, and I'm also prepping to propose to my girlfriend. So there's a lot of things coming up. But also, I'm really, really bad at prioritizing things to do. So instead, I decided to do this because instant gratification. Also, Animal Crossing is really, really fun. So that's a precursor to why I did a kind of hackathon sort of thing on my own time. But there is something that sparked it, which is Cassidy Williams' newsletter. So I've been following this newsletter for I guess since the mid of last year, and early this year I decided to do her weekly problems. So every week she comes out with a new newsletter, and there is one problem where I have to solve. And then usually it's something like a algorithm, interview sort of question. Sometimes it's a CSS kind of question. But there was this just one issue that came: design a simplified version of Twitter. This is completely mind blowing. Like, what the heck, man? That's such a huge task. So some other description was users can post tweets, follow, unfollow others, able to see the 10 most recent tweets in the users newsfeed, and other things are like get newsfeed, post tweet, follow, unfollow kind of functions. And on hindsight, I didn't have to build a full application by itself. Because I saw the other submissions and they were all just utility libraries that does all these 4 functions. But hindsight is always 2020. So because I interpreted it the wrong way, I decided to rebuild Twitter. Right. So for this rebuilding Twitter, I had some self-imposed goals. I wanted it to be a fully functional kind of thing. It's a subset of Twitter, but it still should be able to come up with its own thing. It should be lightweight in the sense that I didn't want it to have all these heavy libraries. It just has to be as simple as possible. I also decided, since I'm going to build a app all the way from back end to front end, I decided to learn some new frameworks. And another thing is most of my projects tend to be very, very ugly because I am really, really bad at design. So that's another goal. I didn't want it to be ugly. And another thing is because of this instant gratification thing, I wasn't willing to spend more than 1 day of worth of effort. So after thinking about it a while, I came up with this feature list. So instead of authentication, we will have this hash identity or something like that for you to identify users. You'll be able to post under any name, and following will be using the names. So multiple people can impersonate the same person just for fun. You should be able to also do things like searching by username or and then you can list all posts and you can list all the posts and pagination by paginations. And because I didn't want to do a proper authentication thing, so the follow and unfollow, I was thinking I can do it by locally stored usernames, so everything can be stored local. And a bonus thing that I wanted to challenge myself is to have some kind of reply or retweet type of functionality. So so now that I have all these ideas, right, I came up with, let's just build this thing. And here's like my process to building things relatively quickly. Maybe this is only useful for hackathons or side projects, not really something we want to do in Shopee itself. So my first advice is to just have a really, really big picture idea. So this kind of concept is kind of inspired by a lot of cartoonists online or artists online. I do watch drawing tutorials, and one of the biggest advice that they like to give is to don't add too much details at the start of your drawing. Similar to this, when we come up with some kind of a diagram to draw or to build an app, right? We want it to be very, very generic, a very, very big picture view, because the details are not important at this part of our ideation. So we just want the core functionality. In this case, I did this first entry, request for ID, and then, you should be able to send a tweet. And then another thing is, when you plan your tasks, make sure you plan it in a way that it has as little context switching as possible. Because if we just go in unplanned, maybe you'll start working on the front end part, and then you'll be like, oh, let me do a little bit on this back end. And then once you're doing the back end part, you're like, oh, let me do a bit on this front end, because you want to complete feature flow. But the context switching between the front end and the back end kind of workflow is actually very, very expensive. You'll take maybe, it can take up to 20 to 30 minutes just to find within your own code that you wrote, what was it you're working on when you move from the front end side to the back end side. Of course, this may be a bit unavoidable for some cases. It's not completely possible to have a full workflow, build a perfect back end, then after that you build a perfect front end and integrates brilliantly. But when you group your process, when you plan your process out, make sure to keep this in mind. So another thing is authentication is really, really difficult. A lot of times when I see hackathons or mostly hackathons, people like to add authentication to their website for some reason. Usually authentication, first of all, a lot of you probably think authentication is really easy. That's not wrong, but in a scenario, in a hackathon kind of environment, or in a side project kind of environment, you don't want to lose your steam before you actually start solving the problem that you wanted to solve. So often, authentication itself is not the goal of your app. It's also a barrier of entry for people to use. In the end, when you build something cool, you want people to be able to experience it, to be able to use it. You don't want to have a barrier of entry to stop them. So try to find workarounds around it. In this scenario, I actually came with this message board idea inspired by 4chan. In case any of you don't know 4chan, 4chan is a message board, and it's good that you don't know about it, because it's full of degenerates like me. And if you do know 4chan, congratulations, you are degenerate like me. But the idea of it is very simple. It has this the input for it is just a place for you to enter your whatever post you want to post. Your username can be anything, and your ID is basically just some kind of hash right below your username. And people can, of course, mimic and imitate each other, but you can find out who's the original thread starter, or who's the one who is pretending to be someone else by just looking at the hash. And then you can see, oh, this guy is using the same username, but he's actually not the same person. Or even sometimes when people want to pretend to be someone else, you'll be like, hey, you're actually just replying to yourself instead of instead of two people having two conversations. So I wanted to build that kind of anonymity. I can identify who you are, but at the same time, I don't really have a user account for you, kind of thing. I wanted to incorporate that into the idea of Twitter. So another thing is, this is a really, really early screenshot of what I was building. Actually, the end result is not too far from this, but my point here is kind of the styles here is really haphazard. So the only thing I focused on when I was building this first version of whatever it was is to make sure that the DOM structure, I only cared about whether the DOM structure suits the styles that I was planning to use. I didn't really care about whether the styles look good or whether it fit or not, because again, context switching is expensive. So if as a front end dev, when we build something, we tend to build this component, then style it very nice, move on to the next component and style it very nice, and then eventually things start to clash with each other, or some error due to margins, these kind of things. It's really good to start on a blank slate, and then you can do proper styling later on altogether. So here's just some of my processes that I usually do. If I do have a project in a hackathon or some really quick project that I need a backend, I usually just do Node Express. And then for the database, I usually use either Loki.js or SQLite. SQLite, I think, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar, but in NUS at least, this is very commonly used as a database because firstly, it's very lightweight, and there is very few features, so you can just focus on the SQL part of it. For Loki.js, is basically the NoSQL version of it, but essentially it's just a file reader writer that read and writes JSON files, JSON objects. And the other benefit is that it has a database-like API to call the read and write functions. And then for deployment, I just have this common setup that I do on my DigitalOcean server. So basically, I just clone and pull, run through the NGX and Certbox to get the HTTPS, and then just run the website on a HTTP server on a Tmux instance, or you can use Screen if that's more to your liking. So this is very minimal way to get something up quick within a short period of time. So for this, I ended up using Svelte and Zapper. So Svelte, the reason why I use Svelte is because Svelte has been very popular recently. Li Hao is a Svelte contributor, so Chen Chen gave a talk on Svelte. So it was really interesting seeing all these developers within our team starting to take notice of this front-end framework, although I'm not very sure if it's although I wasn't very sure if it's really great or not, but it claimed to be lightweight, it claimed to be fast, so that was what I was looking for. And learning something that is a bit different in terms of programming to React would be quite interesting for me. What does Svelte actually do? There's this gist by Rich Harris, who was the one who initially wrote Svelte. It's quite interesting. Do click on the link. Do get the link after this talk. It's basically, he mentioned that Svelte Svelte started off. Everyone thought it was a compiler or it's a front end framework. And that's technically true. But he also mentioned this, that actually Svelte in itself is like a superset of HTML, JS, CSS, because it takes what already exists in the browser and then it gives it a few new functions. It does a few nice things for you, like keeping your CSS within the scope of one file and so on and so forth. So effectively, it is kind of like as close to vanilla JS and CSS as you can be, while still having the advantage of having a framework. So to those who don't really know very well, Svelte is basically, you can link, like especially for the RN devs, right? You may not be very familiar with Svelte. You can think of it like React.js, like it does your front end stuff, it does the components thing, it has a life cycle. Instead of doing that set state kind of thing, it has a variable binding. It uses templates instead of JSX, but the idea is still kind of the same. So and then some people might ask, what is Zapper? Zapper is kind of like the Next.js of Svelte. So in fact, it is inspired by Next.js for React. So it gives you a few nice things like the PWA. It gives you some server-side rendering, and then the hydration and stuff. So I would like to, on top of that, I would like to shout out, just to complete your React, your Next, and then the next one we kind of like want to think about how about building static sites. We want to create a block, we have Markdown, and then we want to convert that into HTML. So I want to shout out to our friend of RK, Sean Wang, Swix. So he has this library called Zapper Site Generator. It's something that is built on top of Zapper, and it has a better data fetching philosophy compared to Zapper by itself. So it's a bit faster. It shifts the logic to a way that is more it's easier to understand, and it's also zero settings, zero settings, zero configuration, if that's more your kind of thing, because Sapper does have quite a bit of boilerplate that's generated for you. So when learning Sapper, when I learn something, I'm not a very diligent person, so I tend to not read any documentation, not read instructions, and just rush into it. And this is kind of like the mentality going in. And I realized that actually doing this in Svelte, it was very easy to use. um, I in preparation for this particular talk, I wanted to be more thorough about my learning of Svelte, and then I actually just gave up on the tutorial. So I think there are like 15 steps. I gave up on the first step, the first part of step 7, and so that's where we are at in my understanding of Svelte. So maybe I can instead of covering more information about Svelte, I can cover like what I did with Svelte and how it will be done in React. And this is a bit this is kind of like a recap of some of my code. So I forgot to mention. So my site is called Twitter. So it's like Twitter for twats. That's why everything is parent twat or twat here. So when we do data or at least state management in the site, we usually do use state for hooks in React, or we do the this dot state, this dot set state in prior to React hooks. And this is kind of like the difference. Svelte already gives you the variable binding for free, and when you do a change, when you change the variable, it will instantly re-render that component. So this is kind of the difference. So instead of having your JSX, it has a kind of a templating engine, and it's not really that different, right? The only difference is really just the start here. Of course, templating is always a bit less powerful than JSX. One takeaway that I can have from this is if you take away some of your power of your JSX, you tend to write better components. So actually within our source code of Shopee itself, I've noticed that we tend to write special render functions for a particular subcomponent of this component instead of extracting out into its own component. So sometimes this power is actually not very good for code readability or code maintainability. And I find that having that ability taken away from you actually helps in your code quality. So this is receiving props from a parent component. So it has, like I said, Svelte is essentially its own programming language that's built. That is a superset of HTML, JS, CSS, and this export let is a very, very weird thing to wrap my head around. But essentially, if you just think of it as getting props from a parent component, it makes a bit more sense. And this is how you would do. Multiple components. Like if you were to do a loop of components, usually in React we will just map, and then we will return the child component in its own as in the JSX itself. For Svelte, we would do each statement, and one thing that actually caused a kind of a huge bug that Kenrick solved for me is that I forgot to put the ID. So remember that in React, we always have key so that the framework can identify which DOM element has been updated. And it's the same thing for Svelte also. And going forward, all future frameworks is something to keep in mind. Another thing that I found really, really interesting was we have some problems that we have in React regarding updating sibling components, and that is usually solved by for us, we would usually think of a framework level solution, like maybe we keep a reference of the whatever component we want to update, and then we update it by itself. Or if we are willing to spare a re-render, we would do something like Redux, or we would, have something to do with context API. In the case of this, right, Svelte has they have some window level directive that you can call. So you can create your own custom event and call it and trigger a function that does something. So in this case, it's actually something that is really, really interesting to me, because we can actually apply this thing back into React. Sometimes we do not want a full re-render. We want to just show some animation due to some user action, but we don't want a state change. We don't want a prop change. In that scenario, we can actually take advantage of this custom events solution to make something happen. So now it's just overall, bringing back to the whole experience. What was it like? So some thoughts that I have on this is it took me a total of 8 hours. 2 hours on back end, maybe slightly less, 6 hours on front end, and about maybe 3 hours of that 6 hours is regretting not reading the documentation and just Googling my way out of every problem that I had. And in the end, I come up with a rough understanding on Svelte. I did have a refresher on a lot of vanilla JS kind of things. And I thought that Sapper seems pretty good for blocks, or you can use the Sapper site generator that Swix did, because it's less auto-magical than a lot of these block frameworks that are out there, and that includes Gatsby also. And it's a lot easier to understand if it's more vanilla than all these frameworks that magically handles everything for you. So now we can look through the actual website. So this is Twitter, which is Twitter for Tweets. So as you can see, Li Hao has already posted something. I'm not sure if this is actually Li Hao, but if he were to post again, we can definitely see the ID over there. So a lot of people are pretending to be me, but you can see there's all the different hashes. So hi, I'm the real Tenzi. And then you can see this guy is different from this guy, It's all different because of the hash. And of course, I can follow all these fake Tenzis. Oh, there's so many. I don't know who's Nala. Okay, and then we have this see more. We can respond to tweets, reply. Hey, don't pretend to be me leh. Right, and then we can go to the following list where there's all this fake Tenzis and stuff. So that's basically the full feature. Everything was built in less than 8 hours. It might seem very little, but when you actually build something, it becomes quite a bit more. Oh, of course, you can also change the username. So like, and then the username changes locally. This is Kenzie. So something like that. Back to the slides. So having built this, would I do it again? I've learned quite a lot in a very short span of time. Actually, probably not. Maybe at the end of 2020, when it's a bit more, when I've recovered from doing this, because this week, the last week has been a complete burnout for me. But I do recommend people trying it out again. So that's all for my talk. The source code is teasing/Twitter. The front end, back end is all there. It's actually really bare bones. If anyone wants to add new features, you can just contribute to it or fork out. Yeah, and that's all for my talk. Ken?
All right, thank you, Tenzi. So we have a question from Kendrick. How to prevent spam?
How to prevent spam? Okay, it depends on what kind of spam, right? If it's human-generated spam, that's not really a bad thing, because you kind of want human people to be on your platform. What 4chan did for preventing spam was, at every post you would have you had to solve a captcha, and now modern captchas have like the reCAPTCHA is just a click. It's a lot easier. It's a lot more human friendly. So I would recommend doing that.
All right, I think that's all for the questions. I don't see any more questions. So thank you, Tenzi.